actually doing a pattern hack of one of my most favorite simplicity patterns. It's my tried and tested pattern, the Simplicity 1426. So the Simplicity 1426 came out in 2014, and it's a reproduction of the pattern from the 1950s. And me being a huge sucker for summer and 50s style, I just had to grab it when I saw it on the shelf. Of the 4 styles that come with the pattern, I've made 3 of them. There's this green gingham one, that's style A, which I made way back in 2017, and then there's this blue tropical version which I made, which is supposed to be style B. And also, side note, I made a matching shirt for my husband for our honeymoon. And then there's also style C, which is what I'm wearing today, this one here. So based on this version that I've made, there's a couple of things that I want to change in the new pattern that I'm drafting. For most patterns that I make, I usually have to make a small bust adjustment. I didn't do it for this one, but I've actually got bra pads sewn into this top. And even then, like, I can still feel like this is kind of baggy, if you can see, without me exposing myself. So what I'm gonna do is definitely take off about an inch over here, something like that, but yeah. And then the other thing is, I think this part of the pattern piece is actually a little too long, so my boob actually ends here. So I want this piece of the pattern to end right under my boob. Yeah, so I'm gonna take off that much, about 3/4 inch. So the first time that I made it, I kind of just did like a super hacky method of elongating the bodice piece, but it really does not fit quite nicely, and I want to try to make it much better this time and have it really cut to the shape of my body with darts and all that. Okay, so this is how I'm gonna be modifying the pattern piece that goes over the bust, like I mentioned. So I've traced out size 4, which is the size that I made for the green gingham version. And then I've taken off 3/4 of an inch here. So I'm gonna be taking off 1 inch this way as a small bust adjustment. So it's probably gonna be around here, somewhere between the dart and the center line. So I'm just gonna eyeball it. Then, because I'm gonna be taking off 1 inch in total, I'm gonna mark points of about 1/2 inch on each side. And then I'm gonna join the dots with the straight line. By doing that, I have also reduced the length of this line over here. So I have to extend 1 inch this way. Now I need a little bit more paper over here. So there's kind of like a general curve going on around here, and this is pretty much a straight line. I don't think it's gonna matter that much. And then I'm gonna draw a straight line from this point to this point. Alright, and I'm gonna trace this part. The next thing that I need to draft is the part that goes under the bust. So instead of just having a band, I will be having the fabric going from the empire waistline all the way down to somewhere between my true waist and my hips. So I've got my bodice block over here, and this is the block for the front. This line is where my true waist is, and I've also drawn on a piece that ends somewhere between my hips and the true waist. This is about 10 centimeters, and I've marked out exactly where my empire waist is. So to draft the bottom fabric piece, what I've done is traced out this area. It looks something like this. So this is the back piece of my bodice block, and this is also the extension. This is 10 centimeters, just like the front. The total length of the side seam for the front should be the same as the length of the side seam for the back. That's 16 and a half. So now that I've marked out the spot, just like I've done before, I'm going to draw a straight line over and then trace out this part. The original pattern has a back button closure design, but that makes it a little tricky to put on sometimes, so I decided to change the construction and have shirring elastic going across the center back instead. So before drafting the shirring elastic section, I need to draft out the side back portion, and that's this area here that I'm outlining with my pencil, and it looks a little bit like this. I also decided to make the back look a little bit more interesting by having a slight curve along the sides like this. I just used freehand to draw it, and then after that I added 1.5 centimeters of seam allowance. I've also decided to have this pattern piece cut on the bias to give a bit more visual interest with my gingham fabric and also a little bit more ease to the blouse. And you might have realized that when I was tracing the back side piece, I did not trace the dart at all. It doesn't matter if I have the dart. I really don't need the dart because I'm gonna have the shirring elastic on the center back piece. So for the shirring elastic piece, I'm gonna be tracing this rectangle over here. And if you remember from earlier, there is this line that's supposed to go across here. That's how long the side seam is supposed to be. But I also added the curve over here that kind of shortened this part right here. So it will end up being here. So I'm actually tracing this rectangle. The blouse is designed to have a band attached here. This width is about 2 centimeters, so I have to add 2 centimeters up here. This is the top part of the backside piece with 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. I have drawn this section here, which is supposed to be that this is the width of the band. So imagine here the backside piece having another band attached. And I've added 1.5 centimeters for the top seam. The length of this is supposed to be equal. So it's supposed to end here. Draw a straight line. And I'm gonna add 1.5 centimeters for seam allowance. Oh, hey, hi. So I forgot to mention one thing, and that is that the width of the shirring piece over here is actually 1.5 times the width of this back section over here. So that's why you see that this is much wider than this. Want to check out my studio pup? I'll show you in a second. Hey, Shiloh. Hey. She's a cutie. I think I kind of mentioned this earlier in the video. The fabric that I'm using to make this blouse in the video is a black and white gingham fabric, and it's the remnant fabric from making this skirt. Because old habits die hard, I am making another coordinating set. Here are all the pieces I cut to make this gingham blouse in this video. And now it's time to put it all together. I started by sewing stay stitches along the straight edge of the bust pieces as instructed in the pattern. I also sewed stay stitches along the top edge of the side back pieces because it's cut on the bias and prone to warping. Then I sewed the side darts of the bust pieces and the waist darts of the bottom front piece. When sewing darts, I recommend to start from the widest part of the dart and then ending at the tip of the dart. I also like to finish off with smaller stitches as I stitch towards the tip of the dart and then ending by tying a knot. At this stage, I have the bottom front piece looking like this and the two bust pieces looking like this with the darts sewn. And now we're going to pay a little bit more attention to the lining pieces of the bust. So when it comes to a style of a top like this, I usually like to add a bra pad on the inside. I used to sew it in, but right now I like to reuse the bra pads. So it would be like a bra pad that you can bind in your sports bra, and instead of sewing it in, I like to actually insert it in the top itself and then take it out and then wash it when I need to. So I can have lots of tops, but I'll only need one pair of bra insert. So I'm gonna make use of this lining, and I am going to leave an opening on the side for inserting the bra pad. So to give a clean finished look for the side seam for this lining piece that I'm using to make a little pocket for the bra insert, I folded about 1/4 inch of the side seam towards the wrong side and then folded it again for about 5/8 of an inch. And then I sewed it in place with straight stitches. And then I sewed the bust pieces together along the straight edge right sides together, leaving about 5/8 of seam allowance along the bottom. This part is really important because I'll be using a kind of a funky method to finish that seam across the empire waist later. Next, I pressed the bust pieces open and understitched the lining piece. Next, I sewed the bust pieces to the bottom front piece right sides together. When pinning these pieces together, I also took special care to make sure that the brown lining piece was laying nice and flat against the gingham fabric. Understitching the brown lining piece is one way to make sure that the lining piece doesn't peek out when you're wearing the blouse, but if you accidentally have the lining piece not laying flat, then you might end up with the lining piece peeping out of your chest when you're wearing the blouse as well. Because of the understitching that I did for the lining piece, I had about 1/8 of an inch, just a little sliver of a brown lining piece peeking out over here. And so I just cut it off so it wouldn't get in my way of gauging the seam allowance when sewing. After sewing the bust pieces to the bottom front piece, I folded the pleats in the bust pieces and stitched it in position using long basting stitches. Now here's my pretty funky way of finishing the seam right here. I trimmed the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch for all the layers except the uppermost lining layer. Then I folded the seam allowance of the uppermost lining layer over and under the remaining seam allowance that I cut off. Then I snuggled up in my chair with a cup of tea to hand sew the lining in place with blind stitches. Here's how the blouse looks at this moment. You can barely see the hand sewing stitches on the front, and this is how it looks on the inside. I usually hate hand sewing, but when I have to do it, I do try to put in my best effort, and I'm pretty happy with the result of this. After that, I placed the side back piece with the front piece right sides together and sewed them together. Before sewing with the shirring elastic, I finished the top and bottom raw edges of the shirring center by making a single fold hem. First, I sewed zigzag stitches over the raw edges, and then I folded the top and bottom edges by 1.5 centimeters, which is the seam allowance, and then sewed it in place with a straight stitch. And then it was time to sew the shirring section. I actually kind of do enjoy sewing with shirring elastic because it gets kind of meditative when you get to the point where you're just sewing the rows and rows of elastic. My tips for sewing with shirring elastic are: number one, make sure you're not pulling the shirring elastic when you're winding it in the bobbin. Number two, use the longest stitches in your machine. That's setting 5 on this one. Use straight stitches and just go slow and enjoy it. You will also notice that every time I get to the end of a row, I pivot and turn the work around, and that's how I did the sewing for the whole panel of shirring. Following that, I tied up all the loose ends with a single overhand knot and gave the piece a light steam. Next, I stitched the shirring panel to the side back pieces of the blouse. You will notice that the side back piece is longer than the shirt panel, and that's because I had a 1-inch hem allowance when I was drafting the pattern, and this is normal. Before hemming the blouse, I finished the raw edges of the blouse by sewing small zigzag stitches to the side seams and at the seam between the shirt panel and the side back pieces. Then I finished the bottom of the blouse with a double fold hem, folding 1/2 inch first and then 1/2 inch again, and then stitching it in place. Finally, it was time to sew the straps. I pressed the straps in half lengthwise and then pressed 1/2 of it in half lengthwise again. I did this for both straps and ended up with something that looked like this. Before pinning the straps to the top part of the blouse, I marked out 1.5 centimeters from the end of the strap with a pin like this. And then I placed the pin directly on the seam between the side back and the shirt center, like this. Then I continued to pin the strap to the rest of the top edge of the blouse from the back to the front and stitch it in place. I didn't stitch the seam allowance onto the back of the blouse because I'll be folding that in later. When the straps are sewn to the top edge of the blouse, it looks a little bit like this. Here's how I folded the strap for sewing. I folded the seam allowance inwards, and then I folded the strap in half, and then I tucked the other half of the strap in. When pinning the strap in place for sewing, I pinned along the bottom edge of the strap and made sure that the pin actually goes through the bottom edge for both front and back of the strap. This helps me to make sure that I'm able to sew both front and back of the strap together with just one row of stitches along the bottom edge. I continued to pin the rest of the strap in this manner and also folded the other tip of the strap in, just like before. Both ends of each strap were hand sewn close at the end of sewing the blouse. Both straps were sewn in place with the stitches running about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom edge of the straps. You can see that I keep turning the work up to check if I've actually caught the bottom edge of the inside of the blouse. Okay, so I finished the top and it's now time to put it on, and I'm kind of scared because I don't know if it's gonna fit, so I guess it kind of fits. impressions, it fits. So it's not super snug, but maybe it's good that it's not super snug. I'm so used to having clothes that are kind of like suffocating. I mean, it fits, but there's still a little bit of gap action here. Okay, the story doesn't end here because the perfectionist in me could not let it go. So I decided to sew a 1/4 inch wide elastic over the single fold hem that's at the top of the shirt centerpiece. But it ended up being way tighter than the rest of the shirt panel, so I ended up with a little weird bob that looked like this. And then that was when I realized that it had to be done. I had to unpick everything to the point where I was sewing the shirt panel. I took a pause, I took a deep breath, and I did it all over again. Oh my gosh, so I finished. I'm really glad that I made the decision to go back and pretty much unpicked everything and went back to the step where I made the shirring section. I think what made a big difference is having the shirring rows closer together. So originally I had them about a centimeter apart, and then when I went back to do it again, I had them about ½ centimeter apart. As I went back to do it, I could see that the shirring section is kind of squished together more, so it's kind of like a tighter fit. And I also inserted that 1/4 inch elastic through the top seam allowance that I have, so you can see that it doesn't quite have the ruffles that I did originally. The next time I make this top, I'm definitely making a dress version of it. I'm not gonna do the shirring elastic. I don't know, maybe I will, and maybe I will only increase it by 1.2 times instead of 1.5 times, and I will actually have a side zipper closure. But next week or so, I'm gonna start working on a bigger, not bigger, but well, bigger because I'm like drafting from scratch again, and I'm not doing a muslin again, but it's gonna be a tropical dress. So if you like what you see, subscribe, all that jazz, and I will see you again hopefully next week. Bye.